6 years had passed since the day when 3 Roman eagles, symbols of the empire's invincible power, were lost in the dark forests of Germany. This event, known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, was not just a military defeat. It became an unhealed wound, a national disgrace that haunted Rome and reportedly caused Emperor Augustus to bang his head against the wall, crying, "Var, bring back the legions!" The empire could not come to terms with this. Honor demanded revenge, and strategic necessity demanded a demonstration of strength. A new hero enters the scene, the young and ambitious commander Germanicus. His mission is not simply to punish the Germanic tribes. His goal is to recover the lost standards and prove that no enemy of Rome will go unpunished. This is not a story of conquest, but of retribution, unfolding in the heart of hostile lands. In 15 AD, Germanicus begins a campaign that will lead to one of the most desperate confrontations in history, a series of maneuvers and clashes known as the Second Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. This is the story of how 5,000 battle-hardened legionaries found themselves trapped, surrounded by an army of 40,000 Germans. Watch the video to the end to find out how Roman discipline and engineering genius clashed with guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the terrain, and what price was paid for survival in the impassable swamps of Germany. What if I told you that Rome's greatest defeat was not the end of the story, but only its bloody beginning? To understand the events of the year 15, we must go back to the year 9 AD, when the empire's belief in its own invulnerability collapsed. The catastrophe that befell Publius Quinctilius Varus was not just the loss of 3 legions, it was the collapse of the idea of Roman order in the face of unpredictable nature and human cunning. In the Teutoburg Forest, for the first time in history, the barbarians did not simply fight back. They destroyed an army accustomed to victory. The Germanic tribes, previously considered disparate under the leadership of Arminius, a former Roman ally and officer, became an organized force. He used what he had learned from Rome against Rome itself. The ambush was planned down to the smallest detail. False information, narrow passages, exhausting marches, mud, and rain. The legions, accustomed to flat fields and strict lines, were lost in the chaos of the forest. This news shook the empire to its foundations. The city plunged into mourning, and Emperor Augustus, according to historians, could not sleep for weeks, repeating, "Varus, give me back my legions." The border rolled back to the Rhine, a symbolic wound that could not be healed. And since then, Rome has lived with a constant reminder. Its power is not unlimited. 3 legions, 17, 18, and 19, disappeared, their eagles, sacred standards, remaining with the enemy. For a soldier, the loss of an eagle was a disgrace. For the empire, it was a blow to its very soul. Augustus was growing old, and with his departure, the will for revenge was fading. But the memory of defeat did not disappear. It lived on in the hearts of those who had seen the charred remains of the camps and the scattered trophies in the swamps. When power passed to Tiberius, Rome expected change, but the new emperor proved to be cautious, calculating, and distrustful of risk. He understood that a new war for the Rhine could turn into a new catastrophe, and yet the need for revenge hung in the air. It was not just a military issue, it was a matter of honor. The empire could not accept the shame, and this internal debt demanded an executor. That person was Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew, adopted son of Tiberius, and favorite of the people in the army. Young, brilliant, with an open face and clear gaze, he embodied the Roman ideal of valor. His legions adored him. He ate the same food, slept on the same ground, shared the dangers in the cold. He did not command from above, he led from the front. And so, when the trumpets sounded again on the Rhine, the legionaries knew that they were not simply going on a campaign, but on a quest for redemption. For Germanicus, this campaign was not an administrative assignment, but a personal crusade. Not for glory, but for meaning. The strategic goal of the campaign of 15 AD was clear and terrifying in its simplicity. The first was to strike such a blow against the tribes especially the Cherushi of Arminius, that the very idea of attacking Gaul would disappear for generations. The second was to recover the lost eagles. This act had not military but sacred significance. To recover the eagle meant to restore honor. The lost standards were like wounds gaping in the heart of the legions. Their return was supposed to symbolically close Teutoburg and restore faith in the invincibility of Rome. Therefore, Germanicus's war was not just a campaign, it was a war for memory, a war against shadows. The preparations for the campaign were meticulous and extensive. Germanicus learned from Varus's mistakes. He understood that defeat began not in battle, but in logistics. Therefore, all attention was focused on supplies. For the first time on such a scale, a fleet was used in a Germanic war. Ships moved along the coast and rivers, delivering provisions and weapons. This was an innovation. Rome was learning to breathe in the rhythm of the northern lands. Germanicus knew that an army wins not only with swords, but also with rations, clean water, and well-preserved horses. Emperor Tiberius watched everything with suspicion. He saw in his adopted son not only talent, but also a potential threat. Too young, too beloved, too popular. His warnings were cold. Take care of the legions, Germanicus. Rome will not survive a second Teutoburg. But Germanicus believed in his duty, and his soldiers believed in him. They knew they were going where their comrades had died, and where every step would be a test of memory. Many had seen the obelisks erected over the bones of those who had fallen 6 years earlier, and every step into this land was a step through fear. By the spring of the 15th year, everything was ready. Tens of thousands of Romans stood along the Rhine, the fleet waited for the tide, and the supply trains stretched for miles. The air smelled not of war, but of retribution. Germanicus understood. This was not just a campaign, it was a purification, an act of regaining control over the past. Every legionnaire knew that if they brought back even one eagle, it would be more than a victory. It would be a restoration of faith. And yet behind this lay a question that still has no clear answer. What motivated Germanicus? A sincere desire to restore Rome's honor, or a calculated desire to cement his name in history? Was he an idealist driven by a sense of duty, or a pragmatist seeking glory at a time when the empire needed a hero? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Sometimes political calculation and personal belief in honor go hand in hand. What do you think Germanicus was in this campaign? An avenger, a hero, or the architect of a new myth? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Ahead of you is a story about how Germanicus led his men through the forests of death and what they found at the place where Varus' legions disappeared. Are you ready to learn the truth about two geniuses whose personal feud determined the fate of Europe? At the center of this conflict were two outstanding personalities. On one side was Germanicus, a Roman aristocrat and the embodiment of all Roman virtues. He was educated, eloquent, popular with the troops, and considered one of the best commanders of his time. His approach to warfare was classically Roman: discipline, logistics, engineering, and a decisive strike with all forces. He was a master of organization and motivation, capable of inspiring his legionaries. On the other side was Arminius, leader of the Germanic Cherushi tribe. His biography is unique. He spent his youth in Rome as a hostage, received Roman citizenship, and even served in the Roman army. He knew Latin perfectly, understood Roman tactics, and most importantly was aware of all their weaknesses. Arminius was a charismatic leader who managed to unite the scattered and often hostile Germanic tribes against a common enemy. He was a genius of asymmetric warfare, preferring ambushes and the use of terrain. The confrontation between Germanicus and Arminius was not just a clash between two commanders, it was a clash between two worlds. Germanicus represented civilization, order, the power of a centralized state, and its professional army. Arminius, on the other hand, was the embodiment of the barbarian element, deeply connected to his native land. His strength lay in his mobility, surprise, and perfect knowledge of every swamp and ravine. He waged a guerrilla war, wearing down his enemy and turning the forests and marshes themselves into his main allies. Germanicus' tactics in the campaign of 15 AD were based on the lessons learned from Varus's defeat. He decided not to take any risks by advancing in one large column. His plan was to divide his forces into three groups. One group, under his personal command, used the fleet to land troops at the mouth of the Ems River. The second group, the cavalry, advanced in parallel. The third, under the command of the veteran Aulus Caecina, was to advance deep into Germany along the most dangerous road. Arminius, in turn, understood Germanicus' plan perfectly well. He did not have the strength to stop all three columns at once. His strategy was to attack them one by one, using his advantage in mobility. He allowed Germanicus to disembark and advance deep into the country, while he himself focused all his attention on the most vulnerable target, the column of Aulus Caecina. He waited for his chance to strike at the most vulnerable part of the Roman army. Both commanders faced internal problems. Germanicus had to contend with Tiberius' caution in difficult weather conditions. Arminius, on the other hand, had to constantly maintain a fragile alliance of Germanic tribes, as many chiefs envied his fame. Which of these tactics would prove more successful in the swamps of Germany? But before they met in a decisive confrontation, Germanicus had a grim mission to accomplish. In the next chapter, you will learn what the Romans discovered at the site of the tragedy of the year 9. What the Romans found in the Teutoburg Forest forever changed their perception of war. One of the first and most emotionally difficult tasks Germanicus set for himself was to visit the site of Varus's legion's demise. This was not a strategic maneuver, but an act of deep moral duty. 6 years had passed since the disaster, and the army marching with Germanicus consisted largely of veterans of the Rhine frontier who had lost friends there. They were not simply marching deep into enemy territory, they were marching to a vast abandoned graveyard. When the legions approached the site, a depressing sight met their eyes. The historian Tacitus, our main source for these events, left a detailed description of this grim expedition. The first thing they saw was the half-ruined ramparts of Varus's camp. Advancing deeper into the forest, the soldiers began to find evidence of the last hours of the three legions: broken weapons and the bones of pack animals. The scene was so gruesome that even hardened veterans struggled to contain their emotions. The most gruesome sight, according to Tacitus, were the trees in the sacred German groves. Skulls were nailed to them, grim trophies left behind by the Germans. The soldiers saw altars on which centurions and senior officers had apparently been sacrificed. This sight filled the hearts of the legionaries not only with grief, but also with cold fury, strengthening their determination to take revenge. It was a vivid reminder of the treacherous enemy they were facing. Germanicus ordered that all the remains of Roman soldiers scattered throughout the forest be gathered. It was a huge and difficult task. The soldiers who had been preparing for maneuvers now acted as a funeral team. They built a huge burial mound where they placed everything they could find. Germanicus himself, as was customary, was the first to throw a clod of earth onto the mound, sharing the grief of his soldiers. This act incredibly united the army, showing that the commander cared about the memory of the fallen. This emotional moment became a turning point in the campaign. Before that, it was just a military campaign, but after that, it turned into a holy war. Emperor Tiberius, upon learning of this, did not approve of Germanicus's actions, believing that it would undermine morale. But he was wrong. The legionaries were filled with determination. After completing the mourning ceremony, the army moved on, but now every dark ravine seemed like a potential trap to them. The campaign was entering its most dangerous phase. Guess how Germanicus planned to conquer what was considered completely impregnable? The experience of the 9th year and the grim pilgrimage to the battlefield of Varus finally convinced Germanicus that standard Roman tactics did not work in Germany. It was not possible to simply lead one or more legions along a straight road. Therefore, Germanicus developed a complex, multi-component plan based on the principle of divide and rule, but applied not to enemies, but to his own forces. The main idea was to strike the Germanic tribes from several directions at once. This was to prevent Arminius from concentrating all his forces in one place. The plan included 3 main strike groups. The first, under the personal command of Germanicus himself, consisted of 4 legions loaded onto a huge fleet of 1,000 ships. They were to enter the mouth of the Ems River and land deep behind Germanic lines. The second group, consisting of cavalry, was to advance by land, securing the flanks of the landing force. The third and most vulnerable part of the plan was the army of the veteran Aulus Caecina. He was in command of 4 legions, and his task was to invade deep into Germany by the most direct and dangerous route. Caecina was to distract Arminius' main forces, acting as an anvil, while Germanicus's army was to become the hammer. This plan was brilliant in theory, but incredibly difficult to execute. It required perfect synchronization of 3 armies without modern means of communication. Arminius, however, figured out the plan almost immediately. He understood that Germanicus's group, supported by the fleet, was too strong. Therefore, he allowed Germanicus to land, while he focused all his attention on the most vulnerable target, Aulus Caecina's column. He decided to lure Caecina into a trap. Caecina's column advanced slowly, building roads and bridges. Germanic warriors constantly harassed them from the flanks, but did not engage in decisive combat. Arminius masterfully passed the Roman column, directing it exactly where he wanted it to go, to an old abandoned Roman road known as the Long Bridges. It was the perfect trap. In the next chapter, you will learn what these bridges were and how they became a deadly trap. The place Arminius chose for his trap was known to the Romans as Pontes Longi, or Long Bridges. It was not a single structure, but a long series of causeways and wooden walkways laid by the Roman army many years ago across a vast, marshy swamp. This road was the only way to cross the area. Over time, the causeways had rotted and collapsed in many places. Arminius knew that Caecina would be forced to take this route to shorten the journey to the Rhine. Caecina's column, consisting of 4 legions and a supply train, stretched for many kilometers. Approaching Pontes Longi, the Romans found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. They were trapped in a narrow corridor. On one side were impassable swamps, on the other, dense forests. The width of the causeway did not allow the legions to deploy in battle formation. They were forced to move in a long, thin column, an ideal target for an ambush. As soon as the Roman vanguard, numbering about 5,000 men, entered the dilapidated causeway, the Germans attacked. Thousands of warriors, estimated at up to 40,000, poured out of the forest and took up positions on both sides of the swamp. They began methodically firing arrows and javelins at the column. The Romans found themselves in a fire trap, unable to attack or defend themselves properly. The heavy equipment of the legionaries and the supply wagons broke through the dilapidated decking, causing congestion and panic. Caecina, an experienced veteran, immediately understood the danger of the situation. He realized that if the army remained on the causeway, it would be completely destroyed. He made the only correct, albeit desperate, decision to break through to a small dry area of land in the middle of the swamp and immediately begin building a fortified camp. This decision demonstrates the essence of Roman military doctrine. In any unclear situation, build a camp. The legionaries, under constant pressure from the enemy, divided into 2 groups. One group formed a tortoise and took the hail of javelins. The other group threw down their equipment and began to work, cutting down trees, digging a moat, and building a rampart. It was a race against time. Arminius, seeing this maneuver, flew into a rage, expecting panic. But Caecina did not lose control. By evening, when it began to get dark, they still managed to build a semblance of a camp, but they were trapped, surrounded by superior forces. What if I showed you how the Romans built a fortress while completely surrounded and knee-deep in mud? The dawn of the next day brought no relief to the Romans. The rain that had fallen all night turned their makeshift camp into a muddy mess. Caecina understood that staying in this camp meant waiting for the inevitable end. He divided his forces again. While one part of the legionaries stood on the rampart, repelling attacks, the other part began to work. They did not try to break through. They began to rebuild and reinforce the long bridges in the direction they needed to retreat. Imagine this scene. Under a hail of javelins and arrows, standing waist-deep in cold swamp water, Roman engineers and soldiers felled trees and laid new planks. At the same time, another group deepened the moat around the camp. The Germans were stunned by this tactic. Arminius realized that if he did not immediately stop this work, the Romans would slip away and gave the order for a general assault on the camp. Tens of thousands of warriors rushed at the Roman fortifications. At that moment, the second strength of the Roman army became apparent: its defensive tactics. The legionaries on the rampart closed their shields. The centurions calmly gave commands, keeping the formation intact. They met the Germans with short, precise thrusts of their gladius swords. While the Germans fought in a frenzy, the Romans worked like a well-oiled machine. Caecina himself, despite his age, rode along the rampart, encouraging the soldiers and directing the repulsion of the attacks. By evening, the Germanic assault had run out of steam. They suffered heavy losses without ever managing to break through the camp. But more importantly, during that day, the Romans managed to repair a significant section of the causeway, enough to begin their retreat. Arminius was furious. His plan to quickly destroy the column had failed. He was confronted not by Varus's frightened soldiers, but by Caecina's hardened veterans, who countered his guerrilla tactics with their engineering prowess. This phase of the Battle of Pontes Longhi became a classic example of the superiority of Roman organization over numerical superiority. 5,000 men in complete encirclement not only withstood the onslaught of a 40,000-strong army, but also managed to accomplish a highly complex engineering task. But the battle was not over yet. They still had to escape from this trap. Would you be able to keep your cool in such a situation? In the next chapter, you will learn about the panic that gripped the camp. After a day of confrontation that demonstrated the full force of Roman discipline, the second night of encirclement began. That night nearly achieved what 40,000 Germans had failed to do during the day. It almost destroyed Caecina's army from within. The soldiers, exhausted by 2 days of continuous fighting, were at the end of their tether. The camp was plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of rain and the distant cries of the Germans, who continued their psychological warfare. It was at this moment, in the darkest part of the night, that the unexpected happened. One of the horses tied up in the center of the camp broke free for some unknown reason. The crazed animal ran through the camp, knocking over tents and equipment. In the pitch darkness and general nervous tension, this noise was interpreted unambiguously. The Germans had broken through the defenses. A cry instantly spread through the camp. "Enemies in the camp!" Panic seized the legionnaires. The soldiers, who had just demonstrated miracles of bravery on the ramparts, jumped up from their places and, without looking where they were going, rushed to the main gate of the camp. The discipline that had been their main weapon evaporated in an instant. Everyone forgot about formation and orders. A stampede began, with soldiers knocking each other down as they tried to reach the exit, which led straight into the hands of the Germans. A few more minutes, and Caecina's army would have destroyed itself. At this critical moment, Aulus Caecina himself once again played a key role. He realized that orders would no longer help. Then the old commander, risking being trampled, threw himself to the ground right in the passageway at the gate, blocking the path of the frenzied crowd. When the legionnaires saw their gray-haired commander lying at their feet, it had the effect of a bucket of cold water on them. They could not run, trampling their commander. The panic began to subside, and the centurions were able to restore order. This night of fear was an important lesson for Caecina. He realized that he could no longer remain in this trap, as the psychological state of his men had been undermined. At dawn, he gathered his officers and announced his plan. No more defense, no more construction, only a breakthrough. The incident with the horse, a vivid historical detail, shows that war is not only about strategy, but also about psychology. Caecina had to win the battle against the fear in the minds of his own soldiers. At the first rays of dawn, the Roman camp sprang into action, but it was not the panicked flight that Arminius had expected. Caecina gave clear and strict orders. The army prepared for a breakthrough. The first order was to destroy or abandon most of the baggage train. All carts, unnecessary equipment, tents, anything that could slow down the movement was left behind. The legionaries took with them only weapons, shields, and a minimal supply of provisions. This decision transformed the army from a slow column into a mobile combat unit. The legions were formed into a special formation, a huge square, or hollow square. Inside the square, the wounded and the remains of the most necessary baggage were placed. 4 legions formed the 4 walls of this living fortress, ready to repel attacks from any direction. It was a formation ideally suited for breaking through hostile territory when the enemy was everywhere. As soon as the camp gates opened and the square slowly moved toward the repaired section of the long bridges, Arminius realized his mistake. He had expected to see a disorganized crowd, but instead he saw a wall bristling with shields, moving methodically forward. He immediately ordered the attack. The Germanic warriors rushed at the Roman square, but ran into a dense wall of shields. At the same time, legionaries from the rear ranks threw their pilums at the attackers. The Romans did not stop. They advanced like a giant armored hedgehog, fending off attacks but not stopping their movement. Arminius made a tactical mistake by allowing his warriors to engage in close combat in the relatively open space of the causeway. This was precisely where the Romans were unmatched. The long German swords were awkward in close combat against the short Roman gladiuses. The soldiers, who just a few hours earlier had fled in panic from an imaginary enemy, now acted as a single organism. They trusted not their eyes, which saw thousands of enemies, but the system of which they were cogs. The Germans suffered heavy losses, their chaotic attacks shattered by Roman discipline. By noon, Arminius was forced to give the order to retreat. The Romans broke out of the trap. They reached solid ground where they could set up a proper camp. They suffered losses, they abandoned their baggage train, but they survived. It was a victory of survival, a victory of order over chaos, a victory of engineering and discipline over guerrilla cunning and numerical superiority. Having escaped the deadly trap at the long bridges, Caecina's army was safe, but not yet saved. They faced a long and arduous march back to the Rhine, to the borders of the empire. They were still deep in enemy territory. Arminius, though defeated, had no intention of letting them go. He continued to pursue the retreating column, using his favorite tactic of 1,000 pricks, constantly harassing the rear guard and flanks. The Romans moved slowly. They had almost no provisions, as the entire baggage train had been abandoned. They had to rely on what they could find along the way, constantly risking ambush. But Caecina made no more mistakes. Every evening, the army built a fully fortified camp. This unyielding routine and discipline ultimately saved them. The Germans did not dare to storm the fully fledged Roman fortifications and eventually fell behind. Whilst Caecina was fighting for survival on land, Germanicus's army, operating on the coast, faced another, no less formidable enemy: nature. Germanicus decided to return his legions to their winter quarters on the Rhine by sea. However, he underestimated the treachery of the North Sea. As the huge Roman fleet, numbering about 1,000 ships, returned along the coast, it encountered one of the strongest storms ever seen in those waters. It was a real disaster, comparable in scale to a military defeat. Light transport ships capsized and crashed against the rocks. Huge waves scattered the fleet along the coast. Ships were thrown onto uninhabited islands or far into enemy territory. A huge amount of equipment was lost, and most importantly, horses. Armorium did not even need to fight. The sea did all the work for him. This storm nullified many of the successes achieved by Germanicus during the campaign. Meanwhile, Caecina finally led his exhausted, hungry but unbroken legions to the Rhine. Their appearance at the border was greeted with jubilation, as they had already been considered lost. The campaign of the 15th year ended with very mixed results. Caecina's army barely escaped, while Germanicus's army was virtually destroyed by the storm. It was becoming clear that the conquest of Germany was a black hole for resources. The campaign of 15 AD, which culminated in the confrontation at the Long Bridges, ended, leaving behind not only the smoke of fires and the ruins of fortifications, but also a feeling of duality, a victory without a final victory, a triumph that hid fatigue. Formally, Germanicus could consider himself the winner. He broke through deep into Germany, passed through the places where Varus' 3 legions had disappeared 6 years earlier, buried their remains, and restored the honor of the fallen. His troops captured Arminius' wife and son, a symbolic blow that undermined the Cherusci's aura of invincibility. In the subsequent campaign of 16 AD, the Romans were able to recover 2 of the 3 lost eagles, not just standards, but sacred relics that embodied the very idea of Roman order. These events captured the imagination of the people. Germanicus became a hero of the entire empire, a man who avenged Varus and wiped the stain of shame from the Roman name. His triumph was anticipated even before the end of the campaign, and songs about him were sung in the streets. But there was a flip side to this shining medal, heavy and cold like wet armor after battle. Military successes were paid for not only with blood, but also with exhaustion that was almost unjustifiable. The storm that destroyed Germanicus's fleet on the way back was a disaster on a scale equal to that of the battle. Thousands of people died, ships crashed into coastal rocks, and cargo and supplies were lost. Only a small number of ships reached the river mouths. Those who survived came ashore without weapons, without horses, without armor, but with terror in their eyes. Caecina's army, surrounded in the marshes and fighting for access to the long bridges, was miraculously saved, but lost almost all of its supplies. These episodes showed that Germany was not just an enemy, but a force of nature that could not be overcome by perseverance and planning. It became clear that these lands could only be held at the cost of a permanent presence of a huge army, with bases, fleets, roads, garrisons, and endless expenses. The empire, accustomed to thinking rationally, saw that Germany was not worth the effort. Germanicus's resounding victories did not change the main thing. Arminius remained alive. His tribes were not conquered, and the forests where they hid were impenetrable. In these forests there were no cities, no taxes, and no Roman roads, only an endless green wall. Each campaign there required new legions and new sacrifices. Rome could enter Germany, but it could not stay. Emperor Tiberius watched this storm from Rome with growing concern. He was cautious and cold, raised not on impulse, but on calculation. In each of Germanicus's successes, he saw not only the glory of Rome, but also a threat to his own position. He was troubled by the army's growing love for the young commander, that dangerous fervor that had turned against the Senate and the throne more than once in Roman history. Germanicus had become too great for a subordinate, too beloved for a subject. Tiberius understood that popularity, multiplied by legions, could turn any campaign into politics. In the year 16, when Germanicus' name resounded throughout the empire, Tiberius made a decision. The Germanic campaigns would cease. Formally, this was because the objectives had been achieved. In reality, it was because he did not want Germanicus to become the new Caesar. The young commander was recalled to Rome under the pretext of preparing for a triumph. It was a cunning move, to reward and disarm him at the same time. The legions, accustomed to his voice, remained on the Rhine without a leader, and Germanicus, returning to the capital, found himself in a golden cage of honors. The triumph held in his honor was magnificent. Eagles, barbarian armor, and trophies from the marshes were carried through the streets of Rome, depicting a victory that did not actually exist. People threw flowers and senators paid tribute. But amid the applause, a cold order was given. He would not return to Germany. Instead, Germanicus was sent to the east to settle the affairs of the provinces, where he soon died mysteriously. Some said it was illness, others whispered it was poison. His death was a blow to the people, for whom he was the embodiment of hope and justice. Meanwhile, Arminius' fate ended no less bitterly. Having lost their external enemy, the Germanic tribes once again turned against each other. The Cherusci and their neighbors began quarrels and strife, and Arminius, recently a liberator, found himself suspected of seeking royal power. In the 21st year, he was killed by his own nobility. The man who had crushed the legions of Rome fell at the hands of those for whom he had fought. His death mirrored the fate of Germanicus. 2 leaders, 2 worlds, 2 victories, and both fruitless. The Battle of Pontes Longi, Long Bridges, was not just another episode, but the culmination of the entire Germanic campaign. Rome proved that it was capable of re-entering Germany, crossing it, and leaving. But it also realized that it could not remain there without losing the very essence of its system. From that moment on, the empire made a strategic choice. The natural border was established along the Rhine and Danube. Beyond them lay a different land, wild but now respectfully separated from the Roman world. Paradoxically, it was the desperate resistance of Caecina and the destruction of Germanicus' fleet that became a lesson in survival. The empire realized that greatness is not only about conquest, but also about knowing when to stop. Peace reigned on the northern border for centuries. It was not a resounding triumph, but a victory of silence, a victory of rationality over ambition. Rome preserved not only its honor, but also its future. Germania remained across the river, and that is why the empire survived for another 3 centuries. We can see that the events of 15 AD were not just a series of battles, but a complex strategic and psychological drama. The confrontation at the Long Bridges showed that the Roman military machine was strong not only because of its weapons, but above all because of its organization, engineering skills, and unyielding discipline. 5,000 soldiers in a desperate situation were able to resist 40,000 because they acted as a single mechanism. This campaign, which began as an act of revenge, ultimately defined the borders of the Roman Empire for centuries to come. It showed the limits of Roman expansion and forced the empire to shift from conquest to defense. The fates of 2 titans, Germanicus and Arminius, ended tragically, but the legacy of their struggle forever changed the map of Europe. Do you think the outcome of this campaign can be considered a victory for Rome, despite the huge losses and the abandonment of the conquest of Germany? Or was it a disguised defeat that was simply nicely packaged for the Roman people? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the great confrontations of history.